Welcome to the WanderLearn podcast. I'm your host, Tapon. In this episode, I have once again Trent Hone, who is the author of Mastering the Art of Command, which is all about Admiral Nimitz, who led the United States in the Pacific War in World War II. But we're not going to be talking so much about that. You might make sure that you listen to the podcast episode previously where we talked about some of the history. Now we're going to move into the kind of the present day. And I'm going to throw him some tough questions. And we're going to start with question number one, Trent, which is, could hypersonic missiles, these are missiles that are going at 5 to 10 times the speed of sound, could they make navies obsolete? And for those who don't know, apparently the United States currently has no defense against such missiles. They go practically up into space and they're coming down at such velocity that it's hard to track them and to shoot them out of the sky. And so in theory, one of these hypersonic missiles, if it's loaded with enough explosive material in it, could take down an entire aircraft carrier that's worth $13 billion. So what do you think about these hypersonic missiles, and will they make navies obsolete, Trent?
First, going to caveat this answer to say that I'm not a modern defense analyst. I look at the history. The book is primarily focused about history, and so I'm going to draw analogies from there because I think they give us a useful window into how to think about modern technologies like hypersonic missiles and how they might work. And so my suggestion is I don't think hypersonic missiles are going to make navies obsolete. I think if we can look at how other revolutionary technologies have been introduced to war and transformed fighting, that would provide a useful window. And I think a good analogy here might be the machine gun. The machine gun has made certain types of infantry tactics obsolete. Tactics that, at least among the major European powers, were fairly common and before World War I. And they quickly realized that, in the face of modern firepower, machine guns and modern artillery, those kinds of tactics don't work anymore. But they didn't conclude that infantry was obsolete. And if anything, it becomes more important because you still have to seize ground, you still have to advance against the enemy, but you have to do it in new and creative ways that allows infantry to survive in this context now. You have to disperse, you have to devolve command to smaller units, and you have to be more flexible in terms of how you fire and maneuver in order to overcome the advantages that a defender has with this kind of equipment. And I think hypersonic missiles will probably be similar. So we may not be able to employ the kinds of tactics that have been fairly common on the sea up until now. And instead, they may have to adapt and adjust. How can you prevent from being seen so that you can be targeted by a hypersonic missile like this? Or how could you disperse forces in such a way that it becomes much more difficult to secure a hit or damage a large number of ships or particularly valuable ships with an attack of this nature? How could you force an enemy to exhaust a number of their missiles, their hypersonic missiles, without much effect, or the things that you could do from a deceptive standpoint to help keep them from being as damaging as they might otherwise be? And if we think about navies, I think the introduction of the airplane, the aircraft carrier, might be a good analogy here as well, right? Airplanes change the dynamics of naval warfare. Initially, they just augment existing functions. They sort of scout, they spot the fall of shot for battleships, but eventually they become a new and powerful weapon system. And navies have to make a transition away from centralized battle fleet to a more distributed network of carrier task forces. In Nimitz's time, the U.S. Navy undergoes that transition. Perhaps there's a similar transition with this hypersonic era and the introduction of more unmanned systems. Maybe the navies are going to invest in or introduce a paradigm shift that allows them to adapt to that new world. It wouldn't surprise me, and I know the Navy is working diligently, the U.S. Navy today, to try to understand how best to integrate unmanned systems into its tactics and operations. I think they have a long way to go, but I think there's a very useful path being charted there.
What do you think if Admiral Nimitz were alive today? What would he say about today's Navy? Would he be impressed, disappointed, frustrated, love it?
Well, Nimitz was very demanding. A quote that I employ in the book is from Vice Admiral Mustin. His oral history. Mustin, as a junior officer, was on board cruiser Augusta when Nimitz was its captain, and when it was the flagship of the Asiatic fleet. And Mustin's memory was that Nimitz's approach was to do things, quote, as close to perfection as human limitations permit, end quote. So that's a very high standard. And Mustin saw Nimitz take this approach with the officers aboard cruiser Augusta, like those that didn't take an interest in growing the skills of their subordinates, of their sailors, would be removed. Not to a lot of fanfare or anything, but Nimitz would see to it that they were sent elsewhere because they weren't meeting his standard. So I think Nimitz would be very critical of today's Navy in certain respects.
Okay, let's go on to the next thing. Now, you may have heard just a few months ago, there was a war game scenario between the United States and China going head to head over Taiwan. And the outcome in the various different scenarios, the United States would win each scenario, but at heavy losses. And did you follow that at all? And what was your take on that war game?
Not very closely, but you gave me a nice link to read, which I've gone through. So thank you for that. There are a few things that jumped out to me that I thought were impressive. One was the use of a physical war game. Right, this is a tabletop with that, and you can maneuver the pieces by hand, and in that visceral sense, I think it produces a different approach to learning than if it were all computer based. So that impressed me. The fact that they were doing multiple runs of this war game with different starting assumptions, that was also impressive, because that suggests to me it's very much about learning for the people involved. What are the important factors here? What are the different decisions that we can make? What are the crucial options that we could seize or that we need to move beyond? And so I thought that was really interesting. Another thing that jumped out from what I read was the importance of logistics. Right, apparently one of the reasons why the United States triumphs in a lot of these games is that eventually they are able to cut off any Chinese forces that make it to Taiwan, and sort of starve them, deprive them of food, fuel, ammunition, etc. And that made me think about some of the things that Nimitz and his planners were concerned about in World War II for a long time. They had a plan to invade Taiwan, which was then called Formosa, and the objective was to do that at one point in early 1945. And logistics are one of the reasons that they don't. There aren't enough military forces. There aren't enough assault troops. There isn't enough amphibious shipping. There aren't enough service forces. Those troops that'll be involved in logistics to make the invasion of Taiwan, then Formosa, really come off, to make it a success. And so it's a large island. It requires a steady flow of material, and if you're able to cut that off, as the U.S. forces were in these war games, then any forces that China brings to the island can pretty quickly be put into a position where they could no longer fight successfully. So that's what winning in the games means, and I think that's a valuable lesson. But we have to remember it's a game. It's based on certain assumptions. Some of those assumptions could be wrong, and I think one of the most valuable things that it's generating is more creative thinking among the people who are going through it, particularly the current U.S. military officers and any allies who are invited to participate.
What do you think is the percentage chance that there is a war over Taiwan between now and the year 2050?
Oh, gee. I do not have a crystal ball.
I know. Nobody's gonna. Did you notice I'm not even betting you $1 on this one, Trent? If you lose, it's not a big deal.
Well, I mean, I believe that there is an awful lot of desire on the part of China's leaders to see Taiwan brought into the fold. I suspect that they are going to be more likely to embrace a kind of integration that doesn't rely on military force and instead allows time and culture to play a role. So I wouldn't be surprised, as heated as some of the discussions and negotiations are at this point. I wouldn't be surprised if instead of any military operation, there are what we would call gray zone activities that are designed to allow mainland China to exert a more dominant influence on Taiwan and ultimately absorb it over decades, rather than some kind of a shooting war. That would be my sense, but I've been wrong about many things. So
Okay, I'll join. I'm in that same club. Now, when I was a naive teenager, I always thought to myself, and I think a lot of people who are listening to this are probably thinking the same thing, that like, why the hell does the United States need 800 military bases overseas? Why does the United States Navy have to patrol all over, be the global policeman, have 11 or 12 aircraft carriers and all this other stuff? Why can't we just cut the United States budget of the military to a quarter? I mean, right now, the United States spends about 45% of all the military spending in the entire planet is the United States military. And a lot of people look at that statistic and they say, well, why do we need to be so big? Why can't we just be 25% of the world's spending, or even less, 10% of the entire world spending? Why do we need to be so much? So if the United States Navy, let's do a fun what if scenario, shrank to 25% of its current size, so it got rid of 3 out of 4 ships, what would then happen to the world? Would piracy erupt everywhere? What would happen? Would you and I become Somalis?
I don't think piracy would erupt everywhere. But your question is seated in what I think is a really valuable debate. Like the nation and its politicians and its citizenry, especially its citizenry, should be talking about these things. What are we spending this money for, whether it's on the military or anything else? So what is a Navy for? What does a Navy do? And I was really struck because the Department of Defense recently issued a response to some congressional input that basically said, focused almost entirely on the Navy's wartime role. Which was extremely disappointing for me because the Navy has responsibilities beyond just shooting wars. You mentioned piracy; that is something that the U.S. Navy has gotten involved in. Trying to ensure the safe transit of shipping across the world's oceans. I think that that's very important. We all in the United States and other nations consume things that are produced overseas. And most of that has to travel on ships. So ships need to be able to transit the oceans. There's a lot of things that transit over the oceans. We can also think about undersea cables, like a lot of the internet connectivity that we rely on, particularly if we work in an international firm or communicate with people outside of the continent of North America, where you're using undersea cables for a lot of that traffic and communication. So very large and significant pieces of the global economy rely on safe transit on or below the world's oceans, and then the Navy has a key role to play there. And I do think that current officers and then the civilian leadership of the U.S. Navy should be speaking about that more, should be explaining in clear terms, sort of this line of causality that you want the standards of living that you enjoy, you want to be able to consume these goods. Many of these things are produced overseas. If you had to buy them domestically or produce them domestically, it'd be far more expensive. So your standard of living would go down. This is why we have and we pay for and we maintain a Navy. Over and above that, it has the ability to participate should war break out, and help further the political interests of the nation. But there's a certain staffing and spending level that I think is necessary to maintain the Navy and secure the global commons, as it said. Now, I do think also that it's important to stress that a lot of that activity happens in collaboration with, in partnership with allies and other nations that may not be in an alliance with the United States, but at least willing to cooperate. And so I think that needs to be, advertised and talked up as well. Otherwise, I mean, 25% of the current size, that is such a major shrink.
But there's a point to that. I mean, the whole point is to get people to visualize how different would the world be. And so I'm trying to imagine on a visual level of some sort, what would be that difference? Because, for example, I mean, like right now, let's say you're in Saudi Arabia or in the Middle East, and you want to make sure that the oil-filled tankers full of petroleum are able to transit, through the Malacca Straits and through all over the world, through the Suez Canal and all over the planet, and do so peacefully through the Strait of Hormuz and et cetera. And if you took away the United States Navy, why wouldn't, let's say, other navies then just make sure that their ship, let's say, I don't know, I'm Saudi Arabia and I have a small navy. So I make sure I'm responsible to escort this ship to a certain point, and then I hand it off to another military navy for another country and say, okay, you kind of help kind of protect this ship from here to the next, port, as opposed to, I don't know what the United States does. I imagine they coordinate all this stuff. I'm just trying to visualize this stuff. I think a lot of people don't know what's the utility of the Navy. So one way to find out how useful a Navy is to just say, okay, let's just take it away and let's see what kind of world happens.
Yeah. Well, one thing that I think I suspect there would be, I don't know if it's at 25%. I'm not sure where that number would fall, but I do think that there's a potential tipping point that could be reached, because you were talking about, well, if there's an oil tanker, it's leaving the Persian Gulf, maybe, the naval forces of Saudi Arabia, such as they are, could escort that. Well, right now, the majority of ships that are out there, they don't need any kind of an escort. Like ships don't have to be convoyed because there aren't serious threats aside from, certain choke points, to global shipping. And part of that is because there are enough naval forces either of the United States or backed by the United States to basically ensure that globally the sea is more or less free and open. And I don't think that some of the other nations of the world believe that that's how things should necessarily be. Like the attitude that China has expressed is that no, the sea shouldn't be totally free and open, particularly the waters around Taiwan. We should have dominion over that, or be able to contest it. We, meaning China. And so they want to be able to keep or we could imagine a future where nations like that want to keep others out of their waters, and they want to extend to their waters, not just from what is generally agreed to be territorial waters today, but perhaps even farther. And that would have serious ramifications, not just for commerce, but also for fishing. Who gets to fish where, and how many fish can they extract from the ocean, and what impact does that have on other nearby nations? These things all have an influence. And I think the tipping point I'm speaking to is maybe if there isn't enough global presence backed by the United States, then it sort of devolves into a commons where there's a lot more of a contested region where it is necessary to begin to escort oil tankers and others. And then maybe the cost of all these goods goes up significantly because they have to be insured. And so then, somebody has to provide the escort, and all that costs time and effort and money. Yeah. So it's good to have a debate. What is the Navy for? Why do we spend this money? And in the United States specifically, I think it's important to have the debate of where of the money that the Defense Department gets, where should it be allocated? What should the relative percentages between the U.S. Army, Navy, and Air Force be? Right now, it's fairly balanced, but is that what it needs to be in today's age? Because the Navy gets a lot of heavy use on its ships to police the commons like this that the Air Force and the Army aren't subjected to the same degree.
Excellent. Now, my final question, which is about the Russian-Ukraine war that's going on. I'm going to ask you to once again put on your crystal ball. I know it's a little bit fuzzy, and we're not betting even $1 on this one, but still, how do you think the Russian-Ukraine war will end?
I don't know how it's going to end, but to tie it back to Nimitz and the work that I did for the book, one of the things that I think is really important and worth keeping an eye on, Nimitz was very good at building a staff structure that helped him make sense of the unfolding war in the Pacific and how to take advantage of emerging opportunities. We talked earlier about how sort of the secret sauce of the U.S. military is individual initiative and an ability to adapt and adjust. And Nimitz was fostering that. And I think we can see when we look at Ukraine that it has so far shown that it has a similar advantage, at least when it comes to fighting against Russia. Right? Ukraine seems to be better able to understand what is happening, on the ground, tactically, and then translating that back up, making sense of that in a way that's effective, that that information could be used for strategic or operational advantage. And so the command in Ukraine seems to be better able to adapt, adjust, and take advantage of things. The Russians seem to be stuck in an environment where information isn't flowing as freely within their command. I've seen suggestions that perhaps upper level commanders have a very incorrect impression about the size of some of their frontline units or their real capacity to fight, and that is leading them to make what we would consider inadvisable decisions if they did have better information, right? Their decisions make sense in light of what they know, but what they know happens to be incorrect. And if the Russians can't fix that, if they can't get to a point where they have a more accurate sense of what's going on and can make sense of that faster, then the Ukrainians are going to continue to have an advantage. They're going to outmaneuver them. I don't know if it's going to be sufficient for the Ukrainians to take back the territory that Russia has occupied, but I do think that they're going to be in a fairly solid position to make the cost on the Russians of the fighting greater, and seek a ceasefire or a peace opportunity that is going to be more favorable to them, more favorable to the Ukrainians. So I wouldn't be surprised if that's how it ends up, or where it starts to head. But I am not, like I said, I'm not a modern day defense analyst. I look at history, and I'm just trying to draw out some factors that were important in history that I think have resonance with some of the themes or some of the evidence that appears to be gathering today.
As a history expert, as yourself, that Russia turned around the tide. The USSR turned. They were getting their ass handed to them during the Barbarossa attack when Hitler was kind of pushing his forces into Russia and practically conquered Russia. And then finally, it took them a while, but they finally kind of got their act together. But that was granted through mobilization. And of course, they were being attacked on their land. And so, of course, the Russians got a lot more motivated to get their act together because they were losing their land. Now it's a little bit different story, because unless Ukraine decides to march all the way to Moscow, which of course they won't, is, the people in Russia are just not as excited to jump and mobilize and do much. So that, I think, is the big difference between this conflict and World War II. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a very significant difference. It's easy. The Soviets called it the Great Patriotic War, for a reason, right? The nation here is their nation is threatened, and the Nazis are a potentially annihilating force, and it's sort of a fight or die kind of a scenario, or at least it's easy to communicate that to the units and down to the level of individual soldiers as well. And I do think that the way, as horrible as the Soviet regime was, I do think that the way in which they were able to inspire heroism among their people is a fascinating story. And you can't do the same thing with the fight in Ukraine today. I know that Putin and his propagandists have tried to paint Ukraine as a hotbed of Nazism, but it's not hard if you can get out of the propaganda bubble that they're trying to create to see the falsehood that is, and so you don't have the same kind of motivating influence for Russian soldiers that you do for Soviet soldiers back in the 1940s. It's hard to see how they could apply a similar paradigm.
True. All right, Trent Hone, who is the author of Mastering the Art of Command, Admiral Chester Nimitz, and Victory in the Pacific, a book that has recently come out. It's an excellent book for anybody who's fascinated by World War II history, about the Pacific, about the navies, and I highly recommend it for those reasons. Trent, thank you so much for being on the WanderLearn show.
Yeah,
and that ends this episode of the WanderLearn podcast, where we explore travel, technology, and transformation. If you'd like to see the show notes with links to what we've talked about, go to wanderlearn.com and click on this episode. If you'd like to connect with me, just remember Tapon. That's my first initial and my last name. Tapon is always my social media username. My website is ftapon.com. Do you want to leave me an anonymous voicemail where you can make a comment or ask a question? Then go to speakpipe.com/ftapon. Furthermore, if you'd like to get rewarded for supporting my projects, then go to patreon.com/ftapon. That's where you can pick up some remarkable rewards for as little as $2 a month. Now, 5 quick favors. Number 1, subscribe to the WanderLearn podcast. 2, download it. 3, share it. 4, review it. And 5, sign up for my newsletter at wanderlearn.com. Our theme music was composed by Eric Stratman. This is Francis Tapon, encouraging you to wander and learn.